Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be recommending some books that I think you should read if you want to be a doctor. Or really anything in the healthcare field, but this is primarily through the frame of reference of wanting to be a doctor. So this is kind of a crossover for me. As you can see, I mainly talk about books on this channel as my main focus, but I'm also a second-year medical student. And actually something that I'm really passionate about is combining the humanities and medicine, specifically through literature. So this video is right up my alley. If you are someone also at this cross-section of liking to read and wanting to be a doctor, then this video is for you. So before I get into the specific recommendations, I do want to get on my soapbox a little bit and talk about why I think it's beneficial to read books about medicine and healthcare and the field if you want to go into it. And again, I'm only a second-year medical student, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm mainly going off of my own personal experience and how it has helped me through my pre-med journey, but I don't have any insight about how it's going to be when I actually am a doctor. But just a disclaimer. So the first reason why I think it can be important is because it helps you figure out if you want to go into this field in the first place. The majority of your exposure to the medical field and contact with physicians is going to be through shadowing and clinical experience, and it should be that way. But a lot of times when you're an undergrad, you don't really know what's going on. You don't know enough science or medicine to keep up with the actual cases. And your time with the doctor can also be sometimes limited, so it's hard to really grasp what it's like to be in their position and how they personally feel about the career. And so reading books, especially those by physicians, can give you a new layer of depth and perspective into the field. The second reason is more practical for you as a pre-med student, and it is that a lot of the medical school application process is writing. Your personal statement, your work and activities, your secondary essays. So much of how the admissions committee perceives you is by how well you're able to write about yourself and write about your experiences in medicine. I found that reading books, either written by physicians or just about the medical field in general, gave me a vocabulary through which I could better write about the experiences that I was going through during my clinical experiences. It was kind of like a reciprocal relationship. Sometimes I would experience something in the clinic but not really understand the depth or be able to process it fully until I saw it be talked about in a book and see how that physician talked about a similar experience. Or vice versa, where I read about something in the book and then I go on to experience that in the clinic and I have a new layer of insight to be able to apply to that situation. I really do credit a lot of my ability to write my medical school applications to reading these kinds of books, because medicine really is a foreign field. You don't really have the language to talk about it a lot of the time until you hear other people talk about it. There's obviously many more benefits to reading and things you can gain and learn from reading these books, but those are just some things that I think are specifically helpful towards people who are trying to get into this field, trying to apply to medical school and become a doctor. And obviously you can get a lot of the benefits that I just talked about through other sources, through podcasts, through movies, through interviews. There's a lot of different experiences that you can get these sort of perspectives from, but I personally like reading, so I'm going to recommend that. So now getting off my soapbox and into the recommendations. So all these books I'm recommending are nonfiction, and this first set is going to be books that really helped me understand if and why I wanted to go into medicine and be a doctor in the first place. This first one is extremely popular. You probably already have heard of it, and that is When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. This is a memoir about Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon who at the age of 36 discovered that he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, stage 4 lung cancer to be exact. And the author kind of goes through his whole life, starting from when he grew up to the path where he decided to become a doctor, and he had a kind of untraditional path where he majored in English and got a master's in philosophy before he ultimately decided that medicine and becoming a surgeon was what he wanted to do. It talks about his relationship with his wife, who is also a physician, and how when they're both in residency and training, the toll it took on their relationship and how they learned to balance being a family while living this career, and of course how all that was affected after he was diagnosed with cancer. It's a really emotional memoir. It has so much insight. It's about this man who has been training for so many years on how to help other people cope with death, how to help others suffering, and how you reconcile when the doctor becomes the patient. He goes through a lot of questions about what he even wanted to do with the rest of his life, if he wanted to continue training, if he wanted to give it up altogether and do something else. Paul Kalanithi unfortunately passed before the publication of this novel, and so his wife writes the afterword, and when I tell you, it's a really emotional piece. It's a really short memoir. It will not take that long to get through. I also listened to the audiobook, which was really well done. So if you're looking for something that's going to give you a lot of insight into what it's like being a doctor and a patient, this is the one for you. The next 3 books are all by the author Atul Gawande, who is like probably, I would say, the most famous medical author, from what I've seen at least. His books are always talked about in terms of being recommended to people in the medical field. Atul Gawande is a general surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Massachusetts, and he's published many books now that are sort of this combination of anecdotal experiences that he's had with research about whatever he's talking about in the field. I've read 3 books by him so far, and by far my favorite is Being Mortal. I'm not even joking when I say that this book fundamentally changed how I view the world. Being Mortal is kind of this examination of death and how we care for an aging society. In medicine, we are of course trying to delay death as much as possible, and with the advances of science, we are getting closer to that. But with preventing and treating diseases, we now have an older population that structurally our society is not really fit to take care of. And so the first half of this book kind of deals with that, going into mainly the US, how the responsibility often falls on their adult children, who often also don't have the capabilities to provide the correct support for the elderly. The second half of the book, though, deals more directly with death. Death is an inevitability, and how do we as a society cope with that? For this part, he weaves in his experience with his father, who was diagnosed with a terminal condition, and the conversations that he had to have about what really mattered to him at the end, what he wanted the end of his life to look like, and if aggressively treating the cancer for the possibility of having a few more months left to live was worth the cost to his quality of life. Like I said, this book really affected me, and I still think about it to this day. I was first exposed to it when I read an excerpt in my Health and Society class, and then later on I decided to read the whole thing, and I guarantee you it is definitely worth it. This idea of how do we talk about death, how do we figure out what matters most to patients, and how do we make the end of their life the way that they want it, undoubtedly carries into your career. I've already started seeing it in my first and second years. So this one I highly, highly recommend. The second 2 books that I read by Atul Gawande, I'm kind of grouping them into one recommendation. I read Complications and Better. And the reason I'm combining them is because I read them very close together, and honestly, they kind of meld as one in my brain. I don't remember which parts were from which book. If you ask me which one is better, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I truthfully don't remember. But in general, I would consider them both good supplementary material. They're both structured very similarly. They're both collections of essays that he's written. Better explores a lot of examples about how the field of medicine has strived for improvement and what it actually takes and means to do better. It talks about how we work towards being better, whether we're in a resource-rich environment or not, and also what we can learn from communities that often lack medical resources because they usually have to be more innovative with their medicine. Complications talks about examples where there was errors in medicine. And so it goes through things like the process of training physicians, medical mysteries and complicated cases that don't always have a clear answer, and how physicians make decisions when there's a lot of uncertainty in a situation. Because these are collections of essays, some are going to be more impactful and stick with you more than others. That's certainly how I felt, and that's why they probably don't stick out to me as much as Being Immortal, which was a much more collective and cohesive work. But these books are definitely good if you want to kind of go through them in chunks over time and just learn more about history and present. The next 2 books I'm recommending are books that I think will help broaden your sense of the medical field and help you understand the ways that interacts with society as well as other academic fields. So the first book I have for this is The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddartha Mukherjee. This is a pretty massive book. I have it right here. It's pretty big. It took me about 2 months to read it. It was actually the first book that I read when I decided I was going to start reading more books about medicine, and I don't recommend that necessarily because it is ginormous. It's 600 pages, but it was extremely educational. So this book is a very in-depth tracking of the history of cancer, deemed the emperor of all maladies. And when I say it tracks the history, it literally tracks the history. We start in 3000 BC when we have the first written documentation of cancer, or what we would consider cancer today. All the way through modern times, we've developed multiple different modalities of cancer treatment. While as a society, we think of cancer as one disease, in reality, it's a collection of hundreds, if not thousands, of different diseases, and that is precisely why it is so hard to treat. And this book goes through those nuances through a scientific and medical perspective, but it also goes through it from a multitude of other lenses. Historically, politically, sociologically, ethically, financially. Any academic field, any perspective that you can think of, this book probably explored how cancer intersected with it. And I think that's the most important part of this book, was showing how pervasive disease influences our society and is influenced by society. So for instance, radical mastectomies were largely the main treatment for breast cancer for many years until the feminist movement advocated for more breast conserving surgeries or less body mutilating surgeries for a disease that primarily affected women, or how the tobacco industry lobbied Congress to keep smoking products legal despite massive evidence of cigarettes and tobacco causing cancer. There's even a linguistic lens we explore with the idea that we tend to view cancer through the lens of a battle that we are fighting, and how that's present in both the colloquial rhetoric but also in literature and different stories. So despite the book being very overwhelming, it is pretty intimidating to go into a 600-page nonfiction book, especially if you haven't read any nonfiction books before. It is definitely worth it, definitely eye-opening. Just take it one step at a time. The next book I have is Medical Apartheid by Harriet E. Washington. Harriet E. Washington is a public health scholar and medical ethicist at Harvard, and she wrote this book detailing the horrific and torrid history of Black Americans and the US medical system. This is one of the books that I think should be required for most medical schools because with the other books that I have mentioned, a lot of the stuff that you may encounter in real life, you may have these conversations with other physicians or make up in classes. And medical schools are doing a better job of trying to incorporate diversity and inclusion education and talking more about social determinants of health and medical racism. But as we know, that doesn't exist everywhere or nearly to the depth that this book goes into it. So I think it's just good that people will read it on their own. Even as someone who was aware and thought I was knowledgeable about medical racism and how racism in the US has affected how people of color receive healthcare, there were so many things in this book that I had not known about. We start from the time of slavery and how slaves were often used as kind of test subjects for doctors to figure out different techniques. That was how the field of gynecology started, experimenting on women without any anesthesia or any sort of pain relief. It talks about the grave digging that was involved to get bodies for anatomy lab for medical schools, which was insane for me to learn. It goes through things like eugenics as well as some more commonly known ethics cases like the Henrietta Lacks situation and the Tuskegee syphilis study. Again, this book is extremely important because you don't really realize how pervasive these systems are and how they affect things even today until you really trace this line historically, as this book does. Kind of related to that, the last book that I have to recommend is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Rebecca Skloot. I do have to give a little caveat for this book to be fully transparent. I haven't fully finished it. I got about halfway through. I do plan on finishing it one day. I didn't mean to DNF it. It was more so that life got in the way, and now it's been so long that I think I need to reread the part that I did read. But anyway, I read enough to know that this book was worth the read. So if you didn't know, Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman living in the South in the 1950s who was diagnosed with cervical cancer. The only place that would treat her was Johns Hopkins Medical School. While she was there, her cancer cells were biopsied and taken to a lab where they were cultured into a cell line called HeLa. And these HeLa cells were especially unique because they were immortal. No matter how many times they divided, they wouldn't die. And this revolutionized science. These cells were used to develop the HPV vaccine, to develop the polio vaccine, to develop all these different scientific advancements. All the while, Henrietta Lacks was not made aware that her cells were being used this whole time. There was no consent taken, and her family were not even aware that this cell line existed until 25 years later. And of course, they also weren't compensated for it. And so this book is basically a journalistic retelling of what happened. Rebecca Skloot is a journalist who interviewed Henrietta Lacks' family, as well as doing research on the institutions and the scientists involved. This is a very significant story in medical ethics history. You probably already heard about it in other classes, but this book does a very good job of not only talking about the ethical side of it, but also exploring how that impacted Henrietta Lacks' family and the legal issues involved and what kinds of reparations could be owed. There's a movie, I believe, for this. I haven't watched it. It has Oprah and Renee Elise Goldsberry in it, so that's also an option. I think a lot of these also have movies involved, like The Emperor of All Maladies has like a documentary for it. So again, whatever method is best for you. So those are all the books that I had to recommend. Over time, I'm going to be reading more, so hopefully I'll have more to recommend in the future. Please let me know if you read any of these books and your thoughts on them, as well as if you have any recommendations for me to read, especially if you have any fiction ones. I don't have any fiction books that really deal with the medical field that directly. Perhaps those that deal with more of the patient side, like dealing with chronic illnesses or disabilities. Again, I love the humanities and I love medicine, and so I'm always looking for opportunities to really explore the intersection of the two. Please let me know if you found this helpful, and thank you so much for watching. Bye.